Hello friends. So I will admit that I have had a difficult time with today's reading, well really yesterday's reading in Genesis chapter 23 when Sarah, Abraham's wife, passes and he has to buy some burial land for him. So the first question in the Holy Method is obviously the H, which is how did we see him? And all throughout this chapter, really, the thing that I saw was that sometimes he makes us wait, but he always provides. So one of the only things that I wrote down that stood out to me in this scripture was the fact that Abraham had been in this land that was promised to him for 62 years. 62 years. And he is still dwelling in a tent, because God has still not given him the land. It still belongs to other people. Like, he doesn't even own enough of the land to have a burial spot for his wife. Can you imagine? 62 years, and he doesn't even own enough land to bury his wife. How many of us would get so frustrated at God because it takes even a couple of months from the time he calls us to do something until we start to see the fruit of it? 62 years? 62 years. So over and over again in scripture, we see that God shows us time and time again that it may be longer than we think before he fulfills his promises to us, like in the next lifetime, in eternity. And so many times we give up on praying and continuing to seek him and the things that he's promised because it's not in our timetable. The next part of the Holy Method is O, which is how can we serve others better because of this scripture. So in this scripture, we have another person who is offering to allow Abraham to bury his wife without Abraham having to buy the land, right? So if you look in the study notes of the Bible, it actually says, our initial thought would be he's being super generous. But then when you look, he actually gives him a price. And Abraham actually does wind up paying that price, but he gives him a price, which kind of could mean that there would be like an ulterior motive. Like eventually he would ask Abraham to actually like pay him back in some way, shape, form, and maybe with interest if Abraham didn't own it already when he did bury her. So a good lesson for us to learn in that is to never take advantage of someone's generosity, but also to use discernment. And when we feel like the Lord is leading us away from just accepting a favor from somebody, let's follow the Lord. Because I feel like that's exactly what Abraham was doing. Like, God was giving him discernment to actually purchase the land instead of just taking it from him. But I'm not gonna lie and say that in my flesh I would be like, okay, I don't have to spend 300 shekels of silver. Sure, fine, I'll take it, whatever. And constantly the Lord would be like, Ashley, no, this is not a good idea. But I would be like, hey, it's free, like girl math. But Abraham was using and depending on the Lord and using his discernment. And that's the best way to go about life. Not just taking handouts from people, especially people who may not be God-fearing. Okay, the next one may be a little bit tricky in this scripture particularly. So I would love to see what your take on this is. But the third part of the Holy Method is L, which is how do we see his love or his promises to us? And I actually didn't see this until literally right this very second. So that's a God thing. But his love, his promises, obviously hasn't been fully fulfilled because Abraham really doesn't own the land. But the fact that God has opened up the door for Abraham to purchase a part of this land to bury his wife Sarah is just a beautiful step forward towards the promise. So it's actually another like piece of the puzzle of God fulfilling this, because now there's a reason for Abraham's descendants to be there. Like there's literally like the mother of the nation, the mother of his descendants is literally going to be buried in this place, right? Which would not have been the case if he would have went back to his former land, where his descendants were, and would have buried her there, where he actually had land likely in his name or in his ability to possess it, because that's where his descendants were from. Then the final part of the Holy Method is why, which is you. How did God speak to you through this passage of scripture, which is so personal to each and every one of us? So again, if you feel up to commenting, you might bless somebody else's heart that reads it. But for me in particular, it was in the waiting. Like, stop giving up on what God has called you to just because it hasn't come to fulfillment yet. Just because you're not seeing enough of the promise yet. Just because it may look far off, or like it's not even going to happen at all, like it's impossible, because nothing is impossible with God. And God brought me to Psalm 37. And do you know that there are so many statements about waiting in that psalm? And one of the ones that comes to mind, it's kind of towards the middle of it, and I can't remember exactly what verse is, and I can't quote it verbatim, but basically the gist of it was waiting for the land of promise, something like that. And it's talking about an eternity, the promise that we get to spend all of eternity in the promised land with Jesus, not blood born, but blood bought to be able to partake in the promise. And you know, whether it's the waiting or the not depending on others or whatever it is, the discernment, whatever God showed you through this scripture, I can assure you, every single time, no matter what you go through, God's always going to lead you to it, because it is for your good and for His glory. Love you, friends. See you next time.